Natalia, and this is my final project shader. You see it's supposed to be a wormhole, and that's pretty neat. So let's go over how I made it. So let's start off by going into Blender, and so we could see I made a cylinder that just has a lot of cuts along here and is UV mapped correctly, or S&T mapped, whatever. And then let's see how that looks inside of the shader. So we can see here that we basically have it here, and I'm just currently showing the SCT coordinates along with timer, which is a value that goes between 0 and 1 over the period of 20 seconds. And that's pretty much the two that I had in Blender, and so it's perfect. But now let's start to make it look like a wormhole. If I look at my reference here, it's basically they look a lot wider, the spots near to you, than the parts further away from you. So I was thinking, okay, let's do that. It's kind of trumpet shaped, I guess, where it's basically thin over here, wide over here, and if I'm viewing it from this angle, right? So how am I going to do that? So basically, I could use the z-axis as the input and the x and y-axis as the output, where basically I want where the more negative is along the z-axis to be basically I'm going to divide the x and y axes by that. So if I go over to my vertex shader, I can implement that, and then there we go, and that looks like a trumpet. Heck yeah. I also want it to be a little bit longer. This is not very much depth to deal with, so let's multiply the z-axis by 2. And then there we go. Now it looks a bit longer. So now the thing is that I don't want to be able to see the end, right? So I want to have it curve off into the distance. So let's see how we could do that. Basically, we could use the z-axis again, where basically the further along over here it is, the more it's curved. But I don't want to just make it linearly affected. Let's go quadratically, so that way it's actually kind of bent. So let's implement that. So now if I apply this code right here, you can see that it looks bent. But I don't want it to just be bent one way. I feel like it's more interesting if the direction that it is going changes over time. So we can basically think of a circle where, and then just have it be bending towards that position on a circle that changes over time, right? And so we could make a circle using some code like this, where we're basically taking the code as timer times tau as the angle, and then we're using cosine and sine in order to basically get the XY positions. And then that would just give us a unit circle that's going around. But you see, I wanted to scale it down by 0.35 which is a very finely tuned parameter, because I want it to be just enough where you can't see the end of it. If I did too much, then it's kind of a waste for all the geometry I have, where there'd be a lot of the tail where you don't see, right? But if I do too little, then you'd be able to see the end, which I don't want. That's the whole purpose of bending it, is make it so you can't see the end of it. So let's see if we can do that. So I'm doing this, and now basically instead of just affecting the x, we're now going to affect the xy. So this code right here should do it. Let's see how that looks. And okay, that looks pretty good. It is now bending around like we want. Heck yeah. Perfect. Time to move on to the fragment shader. Okay, so let's start off by wanting to apply this texture to our shader. So we take the texture as input and the ST coordinates, and then we set the color to that. Pretty simple. Let's see how that looks. Fantastic. This texture right here is one that doesn't look really good right now, but I spent a lot of iterations making it look good in place. Okay, this just kind of looks weird. I want it to be kind of like, look like you're going into the wormhole, right? And so what we could do is, instead of having the camera move, we can just have the texture be shifting towards us, right? And so instead of just using the ST coordinates of the model itself, we can be modifying them first. So what I'm doing here, I'm now subtracting the timer from the T coordinate, and let's see how that looks. Okay, that looks kind of cool. I feel like we want to go a little bit faster though. I also want to be kind of spiraling as well. So let's also affect the S coordinate. So let's see how this looks. Okay, that's a lot more exciting. But it still looks kind of boring. I feel like it'd be more interesting if we actually had two textures applied, right? So let's do it once where it is this, and another one where it's rotating in the other direction, right? But how are we going to mix them together? So here I am getting ST once, sampling it, setting it to the color, but I'm multiplying by some value to scale it down, and then getting a different S&T based upon a different values of timer, and then I am sampling that from texture, scaling that down by a different thing. So that these two things add up to a maximum range between 0 and 1. Let's see how that looks. This looks pretty cool and it looks exciting, but there's just like so much detail everywhere. You can't really have a good sense of depth, right? I want to be able to tell what's in the distance and what's close up. And so the way I decided I want to do this is I want to implement some fog, where the farther down it is, the more it gets affected by the certain extra color I'm adding in. How exactly we're going to do this? Basically, we want where the further away from the camera, the more we want to have the effect of this fog, right? Well, how can we tell it's further along? Well, basically the t of the s and t coordinates, right? Because the around is the s, and then the along is the t. So when the t is higher, then we have more effect of the fog, and then when it is lower, we basically have none. But I don't want to just apply it like that. I want to basically make it so it's exponentially applied, because that's how fog kind of works. And basically just like some math. And now basically I'm mixing between the original color and this other color I defined right here, which is kind of like a dark purplish blue. So this is what it looks like right now, right? And this is what it looks like after we... There you go. You see, that looks a lot better. Now it can have a much more clear sense of depth, but it still is pretty mediocre, right? One thing that is different between this and like textures in reality is that usually there's not just the high level detail. You want to have larger scale detail, right? And if we consider my reference again, you can see, yeah, there's like there's like the little details, but there's also the bigger details, right? Where there's like some regions that are much brighter than others and some regions that are not. So let's work on that. So for this, I made a texture. And so I'm going to basically just map this onto it and multiply by it. So basically anywhere where there's white, it would be the same. And anywhere where it's not white, it'd be darker. Let's see how that looks. So right here, I'm just mapping that texture onto it. And I'm not doing any of the other effects for now. The only thing we can measure by is whether or not it has large scale detail. And it definitely does. These blobs are much bigger than the blobs in the other one. There's one other thing. Similar to the first time we did just the other previous texture just by itself, it looked kind of boring, you know? Like, this looks kind of interesting with one, but what if we had a second one that would also multiplied by it that was rotating in a different direction? That would probably look more interesting. So let's see how that looks. And so we can see now that I'm multiplying it twice, this looks a lot more interesting because now we have two patterns where we pass each other. You could hardly tell that this was a texture that's sampling. This looks more organic. So now let's see how this looks applied with the previous textures that we had already, plus the fog. There we go. We can see that there's now definitely just different levels of detail of texture, which is what we wanted. But let's face the obvious problem. This doesn't look very good, right? What's the way that we can make this look better? The biggest deal right now is that there's not very much contrast. It all is kind of the same color, right? So let's increase the contrast. This code right here is going to add all the channels together to basically figure out where it's bright and where it's not and multiply that by color. So it's going to make the bright parts brighter regardless of hue, and then multiply by color and by 0.25. Because this first part would have made it far too bright. Doing this would make it darker, but then also multiplying by color would increase saturation a little bit because I want to be more colorful. That sounds fun. So make it more colorful, make it more contrasty. Let's see how this looks. There we go. That looks a lot cooler, right? Now this is starting to look pretty fantastic. But these dark patches look a little bit too dark now, right? So maybe you want to reduce that. But before I do that, I've realized something else. Let's look at a reference again. So here is one reference of Wormhole. You can see there's a lot of flashing light because that makes it look more high energy. There's not very much flashing over here, right? And I want this to look really energetic, right? Where do we want the flash to be? I'm thinking maybe these dark sections. Maybe it's like lightning coming from the high energy sections to the darker areas, right? It's like lightning kind of, I don't know. You could use your imagination, but how do we make the dark sections lighter? Well, let's make it dark in the first place. It's this texture multiplying by it. What if we just mix this texture with white whenever we want to have a flash? And then when we don't want to have a flash, we just have it be just normal. Let's do that. But first we need to figure out what is the mechanics of a flash? Like if you were to draw like a curve, what would like the shape of a flash be, right? I think it'd be kind of like not very much, and then jump up a lot, and then jump down a lot, right? But I want it to be smooth, right? So let's figure out how we can make an equation that does that. To do this, I use Desmos. As the input for everything, we have timer, right? And so this is pretty much what timer looks like. It goes between 0 and 1. I don't really want it to reset, right? I want it to go up to a lot, but then I want to go down, right? I want there to be a smooth way up and a smooth way down, even if I want it to be kind of sudden. So instead of using a sawtooth wave like this, we can use a triangle wave. And so to do that, I'm just multiplying timer by 2, subtracting 1, take the absolute value of that, which ends up turning it the sawtooth wave to this triangle sort of wave. Now, in order to spike this, we could multiply it by itself a couple times. We make it less, but then it's still going to be 1 when it's 1, still going to be 0 when it's 0, but everywhere else it's going to be more 0, and the more 0 it is, the more 0 it will be, right? And so this is my spike equation. That looks like a good spike for lightning. So I basically created that in this code right here. So now let's drive the multiplication thingamajiggers by it. So what exactly is happening here? Basically, we're using spikes, and we're passing a timer times some high number, right? Because we want the spikes to be more frequent, because the timer takes 20 seconds to go from 0 to 1, right? So this is going to happen very slightly less than once a second. This is going to happen slightly more than once a second, right? And we're adding the two together with different multipliers, so that basically there's the flashes can happen at like seemingly random frequencies at different amounts, and we're doing it to the two different textures independently, so maybe it looks even more kind of random at the locations it's at, be either at the first texture's locations or the second texture's locations. And I'm using specific multiplication, so basically it has a base value of 0.3, and then these first spikes bring it up to 0.6, and the other spikes would bring it up to 0.7, and if they're happening at the same time, which would be very rare, but occasionally it would be all the way up to 1. And so then instead of doing just the original texture by itself that I'm multiplying, I am mixing between the multiplication texture and 1. And so when it's 1, where it's maximum flash, it's going to be not doing any multiplication at all, so the dark areas are not going to be darkened at all. But as a baseline, it's going to be 0.3, so it's going to be mostly multiplying by that, but just a little bit of hint of the 1 in there. And I'm doing that to both of the two channels I'm multiplying by. So let's see how that looks. And so we could see that that looks pretty good, right? We can see that there's some flashes in there, right? Looks a little bit like lightning, kind of. And that's pretty exciting. And also the problem with having the dark areas be too dark is now resolved. Heck yeah. Now there's just one final effect I wanted to apply. You can have a sense of depth of like the farther areas down the tube versus the closer areas, right? But it still kind of just looks like a pretty solid wall. I want it to look like there's layers, right? I kind of look like this wormhole is kind of like a cloud, more of not just like a solid tube, right? You can very clearly see it's a tube by just looking at it from 3 dimensions, right? But we don't want it to look like a tube, right? We want to give illusion. And so a good way to do that is by providing more things that provide depth, right? Like things might be closer to us, right? Like what would be closer to us? Like a little like particle of dust, right? So I'm thinking particles of dust and things that are closest to us move faster, right? So I'm thinking having just like little dots fly by. And so I made this texture. This texture is little particles of dust, and I was like, why do I have RGB channels if I'm not using it all? So I added a little bit of chromatic aberration to it. I did that kind of on a whim, and it has a really big effect, which is cool. And so here's just with the dust and the fog. And we can see this looks pretty neat, right? So I'm basically having the dust particles move a lot faster, and I have two different layers of them. I have one moving clockwise, one is just standing still, and one of them is moving a lot faster than the other. One of them's like more zoomed in than the other. So basically having two different layers of these dust basically make it look even more three-dimensional than it was before. And you can see this better if I make it go slower. This is going to be 10 times as slow. And so we can see now that we have like two different layers. It gives kind of this depth kind of effect, right? Which is really cool. So now let's apply this to everything else. Heck yeah, that looks pretty darn neat. We can now see the dust and everything else going on at the same time. Let's bring it back up to normal speed. And there we go. Now this is the finished wormhole effect. Have the dust and the different dark areas, but the lightning and everything's moving, and it's really exciting. So now I'm just going to talk about some of the things I wish I did differently, but I don't have time to change. The biggest thing I wish was different was the particles. I feel like there's too many. But in order to change that, I'd pretty much have to entirely redo the particle texture. But this took forever to make, and I don't want to have to redo that. Yeah, one other thing I was thinking I was going to apply for a while, I was going to do some post-processing effects, notably apply some bloom. But I've decided against that. I've implemented post-processing in GLMan before and in other programs as well, but I have not figured out how to get it to work in GLMan specifically in a way that looks good. Render to texture, I've always just have it like, it looks really low resolution for some reason. It doesn't look very good. And so I'd prefer it look like this than have it look low resolution. And I don't really think it needs bloom anyway. It already looks exciting enough. Um, yeah, I had a lot of fun in this class. Yeah. All right. I guess that's all. Um, bye bye.